This is Under the Tree, a seminar on freedom with Bill Ayers.
Chesa Boudin, welcome to Under the Tree. Great to have you.
Bill Ayers, great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. I wanted to have a conversation that is more of a conversation than a Q&A. And I guess I want to start by asking you, you get interviewed a lot. What do people always ask you? What do they want to know?
I do get interviewed a lot these days. That is true. I suppose it depends on the particulars of the interview. Sometimes it's, a really kind of narrow specific topic. Earlier today, I had an interview scheduled with the LA Times, and they were doing a comparison between different counties across California and looking at our response to COVID, specifically our implementation of a couple of the emergency statewide orders that the Judicial Council and the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court had put in place. So sometimes it's really narrow and specific like that. And other times it's a broader, free-ranging interview, about my vision for criminal justice reform, my personal experience growing up with incarcerated parents. It does depend on the interview.
Yeah, I mean, I think that we should tell people that you are the newly elected district attorney of San Francisco, and that's why people want to know your policies and your vision, and also what practical steps you're taking. So I think I'll steer away from that.
That is. I got to just tell you, you'll get a kick out of this. I'm sorry to interrupt, but it is usually where people start the interview with me being elected this past November, took office January 8th. So a little over 100 days in now. I did an interview last night with a high schooler who is a reporter for the University of Chicago Laboratory High School paper, The Midway, who my alma mater.
Your alma mater, yeah.
Yes, and he wanted to know what I thought was important for activists to think about, and what sort of the future of activism looked like. So it was a little bit of a different interview.
That is a bit different. But, in a way, you get interviewed so much, and you spent a year campaigning for this office or so, and you hear the same questions over and over. Don't you find yourself going on automatic pilot?
Try not to. I think it's a fine line between being organic and honest and original and responsive to the questions, and also being really fluent in the conversations that you're having, sometimes over and over again. I think of it a little bit like how I think about learning a foreign language. And when I was learning Spanish, this is a bit of a digression, but when I was learning Spanish, I remember, the parts of the Spanish language that were easiest and most comfortable for me in the beginning were the introductory greetings. Hello, how are you? My name is, I'm from Chicago, I'm from San Francisco.
Sure.
And over time, you kind of build from there in your comfort level. And I think the same thing is true when it comes to these media conversations. The more you do public speaking or answer journalist questions about a particular topic, the more precise and concise you get in getting your message across in a particular forum and format.
Gotcha. Well, I like the kid who asked you about activism. I want to ask you a similar question, which is, how do you name this political moment? Where are we on the clock of the universe? What's going on? How do you see this moment?
It's a great challenge to have any sort of historic perspective when you're in a moment of, really an unprecedented moment of volatility and change. I mean, one of the things that makes this moment so volatile, whether you're looking at the stock market, whether you're looking at government policies, whether you're looking at educational, programming, whatever area of life you're looking at, it is a very volatile moment. And part of what that means is we don't really know where we are or where we're going. And so it is very difficult to have historical perspective or to plan for the long term. I'm in the process right now of trying to plan a budget and staffing needs for my office over the course of the next several years that I'll be in office. And it's virtually impossible to do that because we don't know what's going to happen to the city budget. We don't know what's going to happen to crime rates. Much more so than in a normal moment in history. Things are volatile and unpredictable. So I hesitate to answer that question directly because I think in some ways the volatility speaks for itself. We don't know where we are or where we're going.
Yeah, but I admire the fact that you didn't mention Trump in your answer. Um, that
I
was
try. I
that
try
was
not to use his name if I can avoid it.
that was good restraint. But of course, you're right that it's hard to name a political moment. It's a volatile political moment. But in a certain way, isn't that always true? You think you can predict the future, and then boom, COVID-19 happens, or you think you know what you're going to do next year, and things get into a shambles. Sometimes I think of it as the queer art of failure. That when things are going along normally, you kind of have this illusion of predicting. But when things get knocked off track, it becomes a whole new challenge to rethink, to allow your imagination to grow, and so on.
That's
So
fair, and
I think
yeah,
you're right.
that's fair. You could even say that what's normal and predictable is the unpredicted.
Exactly.
That you can expect the
Exactly.
unexpected.
Exactly. And I think that when you start to think about what you can predict, you're going to something very practical. What about the budget? What about hiring and so on? But there's another way to think about it, which is these big forces, like the fact that there's been a right-wing kind of push inside the American political system, and there's some resistance. I'd be interested in your talking a little bit about that. You're in touch with both sides of the thing.
Both sides of which thing? What do you mean by that?
Well, what I mean is you're in touch with activism. You've been an activist. You're also now an elected official. In fact, I think maybe I'm wrong. Are you the top criminal justice person in San Francisco?
They call us the top cop or the chief law enforcement official.
Gosh,
Yeah, I'm
you don't look like a cop. I don't know what it is. I mean, why
well,
is that?
I am not a police officer standardized training certified cop in that sense. I've never been to the police academy, never served as law enforcement before, but as an elected sort of civilian law enforcement official, it's my job to make law enforcement policy. Now, I don't oversee in most regards. I don't oversee the San Francisco Police Department. They're an independent body. The chief is appointed by the mayor, and there's a police commission that oversees the department and makes policy. But I do decide how we're going to handle each case that the police department brings us, and I do decide in conversation with the police chief and the police department what to prioritize and what kinds of evidence we want them gathering and how we want them building cases and what sentences we're going to seek in cases. So it is known as the chief law enforcement officer, and I do have regular conversations with all the various law enforcement actors in San Francisco and beyond. And we're in a moment where, luckily, crime has fallen dramatically across the country. 40%.
Why has it?
Well, it depends what categories of crime you're looking at. In San Francisco, one of the areas that drove our crime rates, if you just look at just raw numbers, one of the areas that drove our crime rates was property crime, auto burglaries and commercial burglaries and thefts, crimes of opportunity, crimes that some would say are a reflection of unprecedented wealth inequality in San Francisco, in the Bay Area, and in this country. And right now, because of the shelter-in-place order since March 16th in San Francisco and across the Bay Area, not only is it harder for people to move around who would seek to commit these property crimes, but there's also far fewer opportunities. The stores that people go shopping in are closed. The tourists who accidentally leave a valuable laptop on the backseat of their car when they go into a park or a tourist site, a museum, are not coming to San Francisco. So we just don't have the opportunity for many crimes of opportunity.
Yeah, but don't you imagine, with the kind of immiseration that's going to accompany the vast unemployment and so on, that this could reverse itself on a dime?
That's what we're trying to plan for. We want to be ready
Yeah.
if and when that happens. We want to prevent it. And one of the ways we prevent it, of course, is, I think the traditional and in some ways short-sighted way that you plan for and prevent that is, beefing up your police force, having a visible presence, doing more patrols, that kind of thing. Another way that I am urging other local elected officials to pursue is through investing in community and investing in supporting people who are unemployed, who are unhoused, who don't have access to health care, so that people aren't in a position where they have to commit crimes of desperation to survive. And it's been really frustrating, more so at the national level, for me to watch as the federal government gives away literally trillions of dollars to the to the ruling class, to the corporate hedge fund, private equity groups, the folks who took huge risky bets to make more money when things were good. And now that things are bad, they're the first to get paid out, while other people who were working really hard as busboys or as gardeners or as janitors are not only without a job, but there's no bailout, there's no support. And if they commit a crime to support their family, I'm going to be asked to put them in jail and seek a stiff punishment. And so it's frustrating to see that play out at the national level, at the state level, and in some places, in some ways, at the local level. We're still trying very, very hard to get people who are unhoused off of our streets and into all the vacant hotel rooms in San Francisco. And It's been a huge fight locally. But we're safer.
Some of that. Yeah, I saw some of that on the news. You got a lot of housing, you got a lot of unhoused people, but you don't make the match because capitalism doesn't let you make that match. I mean, it's crazy in a lot of ways. But I also think, you're in this position, and we're living in a time when, in some ways, punishment is what we always think of when somebody makes a mistake, makes an error in judgment, error in behavior. And so we immediately think punishment. And when we think punishment, we immediately think the cage. So in some ways, I think incarceration is like the last entitlement. You're not entitled to a decent education or mental health services or housing or food or healthcare, but you are entitled to go to jail. And in a weird way, that's, all these social problems kind of get congealed in your world.
That's right. We're the last stop on the train. We don't invest in healthcare. So mothers who are pregnant, often don't have access to regular healthcare if you're living in certain communities. We don't invest in education. So we know that our public school systems are failed and getting worse, in almost intentionally, almost as a matter of national and state policy. We don't invest in access to food. So we know that there are nutritional issues, and we don't invest in getting rid of asbestos or lead paint from poor communities and housing projects. And so we don't, we're unwilling to meaningfully take on the gun industry and stop the mass production and distribution of guns into poor neighborhoods. And you see this line of problems, and you can call it the school to prison pipeline, or you can call it any number of things. But regardless of whether we're talking about schools or mental health care or any of these other areas, the last stop is the criminal justice system. It's where society's inequities and inequalities and failings are dumped. And we are expected, now I want to go back to something you said a couple of minutes ago, Bill. We're expected to punish people when they transgress whatever the particular rules or laws are. I like to think about what I try to do as accountability rather than punishment. Sometimes there's overlap. Sometimes punishment is part of accountability, but accountability is broader, and it creates space for rehabilitation. It creates space for being accountable to the person or community that you've harmed, rather than myopically focusing on a retributive punishment, which is what the criminal justice system does well and why it's a failed system.
That makes sense. Even talking about criminal justice reform sometimes feels like an oxymoron. I mean, I think you're the top law enforcement officer, but is there such a thing as this neutral thing called law enforcement or the rule of law? How do you think about that?
I've seen already, just in my first 120 days or so in office, that the system is set up to really efficiently enforce certain laws against certain categories of people, and that it makes it almost impossible to enforce other laws against other categories of people. So let me be a little more specific, and I'll give a couple examples. I went to Yale College in New Haven, Connecticut, and sadly, on Yale's campus, it was not uncommon for laws to be broken, particularly laws around underage drinking, use of recreational but illegal drugs, and of course, sexual assault. at fraternity parties and at other parties were regular occurrences. Underage drinking and sexual assault were regular occurrences, and they are, in fact, in most college campuses. Yale has its own police department, but its police department almost never investigates, that I'm aware of, never heard. And, we get these email alerts when you're a student or about any new criminal activity. You almost never that I can remember, got an email from the chief of the Yale Police Department saying, we busted a party with underage drinking, or we found someone who was using roofies to date rape sorority sisters, or. But what we did hear all the time was the Yale Police Department enforcing drug laws in mostly Black or Latin neighborhoods on the other side of the city that had nothing to do with Yale. They weren't connected to Yale, or Yale's police department arguably had no business being there. And the criminal justice system was very well set up to take those cases and to secure felony convictions and often prison time in ways that wreaked havoc on these communities and perpetuated a cycle of poverty, of desperation, of addiction, of economic lack of opportunity and inequality, while Yale students could essentially violate those same laws with impunity. We see that play out all across the country. We see it in San Francisco. We see it with big corporations. Just today, the Attorney General of California filed a landmark lawsuit that was called historic because it seeks to require that Uber and Lyft follow the law. Now, it is a major step. It is critically important that they not systematically misclassify their employees as independent contractors to save billions of dollars to avoid paying into the state workers' compensation and unemployment insurance fund. But why is it historic that we're enforcing the law against corporations? We do it every day against the little guy.
Right. Makes sense. I mean, it's funny, this coronavirus moment, I mean, it's an illuminating moment in a lot of ways, but you see things like the Chicago Public Schools announced with great fanfare, we're going to put soap in the children's bathrooms. And you're like, what? There was no soap? You monsters, right? And again and again. So here we are, it's a big deal to enforce the law. I mean, that is crazy.
It's frustrating, and it is one of the things, I try to find silver linings in this moment. It's a moment of crisis. It's a moment of desperation for so many people. And we don't even know the full extent of it yet, of course, but people are dying every day. And some of them are people I'm close to, that you're close to. We've gotten some sad news about extended family members who've passed, probably because of COVID-19 just in the last couple of days. It's a very, very sad moment. And so I'm focused as an optimist. And I think, to be an activist, you have to be an optimist. To be someone who's socially engaged, you have to be an optimist. You have to believe in the potential for making things better and for positive change. So in this moment, I try to find silver linings, and I try to create silver linings when I can't find them out there in the world. And that means things like using this moment to really drill down on who's in jail and why, and identify people who maybe shouldn't have been in jail in the first place. We found a woman in San Francisco County Jail on a misdemeanor with no criminal history, with some underlying mental health issues, who had a high-risk pregnancy. Why do we have a woman with a high-risk pregnancy in jail when she has no criminal history? It makes no sense. It shouldn't take COVID-19 to find that person and get them into a prenatal care center where they can get the healthcare they and their baby needs. That's what public safety looks like. That's how we keep every member of our community safe.
Right. Well, you raise this question of people who shouldn't be in jail or people who should get out. Say a word about your other father, my compadre, David Gilbert.
Sorry, there's just a lot of noise in the background. I don't know if you can hear it. I'm trying to minimize, but
did you hear me or no?
I heard your question. Making more work for your editor here. Sorry.
That's okay. Yeah. He's a good man. Go ahead, Malik.
So as you know, when I was 14 months old, my biological parents left me at a babysitter, and they went off for the day to participate in an armored car robbery. they never came back to get me at the end of the day because the robbery went terribly wrong. Even though they weren't personally armed or even at the scene of the robbery itself, the people who did the robbery were armed, and a security guard was killed. And then later that same day, 2 police officers were killed. My parents were both arrested. My mother ended up serving 22 years in prison. My father is still incarcerated now, having served 38 years. He's 75 years old, does not have a single disciplinary violation on his record in all 38 years in New York State prison. And just this past week, the person in the cell immediately next to his was evacuated from his prison with COVID-19.
Oh my God.
So we're looking at a category of person. Obviously, for me, it's very, you know, it's very personal and it's very close to home, and you know him well, and it's hard to have someone you love and care about be exposed to risk under any circumstances. But when it's not necessary for any broader public purpose, I mean, the folks in my office who work for me come into court and they take a certain amount of risk every day because we're an essential government agency. And I ask my staff to do that, and that provides me with some level of anxiety. But we're an essential service. Keeping someone who's 75 years old, who has no history of discipline violations, who has underlying medical conditions, who presents zero risk to public safety, zero risk of recidivism in jail at a high cost to taxpayers makes no sense. It serves no purpose. It can't and never will undo the harm that the crime caused, and it's grossly disproportionate to the role that he played. So it's emotionally and intellectually frustrating to watch someone I love and someone who I know to be a profoundly good and kind and generous person exposed to such horrific and preventable risk.
Is there a chance he'll get out?
Never say never. His minimum sentence is 75 years, so he'd have to live until the year 2056 to be eligible for parole.
That's not happening.
That's not happening. So the only path for him to get out would be if the governor took, extraordinary clemency action and specifically commuted his sentence or a class of other inmate sentences. And, I make this point in a forthcoming op-ed that's going to be run in the LA Times this week. But if you look just empirically, if you just let data inform your policy, and you look across the board at people who are over the age of 65 in prison, they have a recidivism rate of less than 4%. Now that rate drops even further if you look at people like my father who are over the age of 70, or if you look at people who've served, like my father, more than 10 years or more than 20 years. Governors across the states should be looking at the prison population, identifying people who are elderly, who have served substantial periods of time, and who have reentry plans, and they should be allowing them to reenter society. That's actually going to make us safer. It's going to save lives.
Good point. Can you imagine a society without prison?
I can. It's a long way away. I don't see us being there in a society that looks like the one we currently have. And I say that because we live in a society where there's so much violence, structural, institutional, physical, so much access to weapons, so much inequality, so much violence that's part of our culture on TV and in music videos and in police interactions with poor communities. And so that violence begets violence. And when we have violence and when we have a totally failed mental health system, it creates a recipe for having some small number of people who really are not safe to be released to the community under normal circumstances. But I think we can easily get to a place where jails and prisons are a fraction of their size today and where they look unrecognizable from their current mass incarceration, prison industrial complex form.
But in a way, you just named the circumstances under which a world without prisons would be possible. Inequities have to disappear, healthcare, guarantees of housing, income, and so on, right? I mean, you just said it can't be done in this world, but with the structural violence and the institutional racism, but maybe those are things we could also chip away at and transform.
That's how we make ourselves safer. Safety is not just about property crime. It's not just about your laptop being safe on your, on the back seat of your car when you're a tourist in San Francisco. That's important, but it's also important that people who are unhoused not live in fear of getting sexually assaulted in their tents, and that people who are Black and brown not live in fear of getting stopped by police and getting shot, and that people who have worked their whole lives not live in fear of dying on the streets because Uber and Lyft refuse to pay into the state unemployment fund.
I've taken so much of your time. I want to ask you a couple of quick questions, if it's okay, to finish up.
Sure, of course. You've given me a lot of time over the years too.
I appreciate that. I didn't think you noticed. Just kidding. What are you a nerd about?
A nerd?
Yeah. What are you a nerd about?
About a lot of things. As you'll remember well from when I was in high school, I used to love biology, and this is sort of pre-Google. I would memorize all kinds of facts, and I still like to nerd out. Especially on criminal justice statistics and data. It's really important to me that the decisions we make and that the policies we implement be informed by and driven by and responsive to data as much as possible. And it sounds obvious, it sounds like an easy thing, but the reality is most criminal justice policies today and throughout American history have not been driven by data. They've been driven by fear and by extreme outlier cases. Probably the most famous example is Willie Horton, but pretty much every draconian, punitive law that makes up the infrastructure of mass incarceration was a response to a particular heinous crime. Not to data, not to the median or the norm or the average or to what was tested over time to actually reduce crime or keep us safe. And this is a point that a friend of mine, author of a recent book called Usual Cruelty, makes in his book. His name is Alec Karakatsanis. But he says, when reformers, people like me, when reformers are trying to do something new, to implement strategies aimed at decarceration or restorative justice or decriminalization of drugs or decriminalization of sex work, critics always say, well, does it work? And they always point to the one example where you let somebody out of jail without money bail and they went and committed a heinous crime. And look, recidivism is a reality. 2/3 of people coming home from state prison will be back in prison within a couple of years. Nobody has ever said, does it work to mass incarceration? No policymaker has ever said, well, where's the data that shows that prison is an effective response to drug addiction? Nobody's ever done that test or run those numbers. So I'm a nerd about saying, let's look at what we're doing, how we're responding to what we define as deviant behavior, and make sure that what we're doing has some rational, empirical support at one of three critical things that are always my goals as a policymaker, as an elected official in the criminal justice space. One, does it reduce or prevent crime going forward? 2, does it heal or restore the person or people who were harmed by this particular crime? And 3, does it rehabilitate the individual that we believe committed the crime in a way that allows them to safely and successfully reintegrate into their community? And if it's not doing any of those things, and there's very good evidence that jail does not do any of those things in many cases, then why are we doing it? And why are we doing it as a first and primary response to so many different kinds of social problems, mental illness, addiction, poverty, as well as the full range of criminal activity that we prosecute?
That's a pretty good thing to be a nerd about. You told the story you mentioned earlier, and you've told the story many times about your biological parents going to prison when you were 14 months old. And that's the moment at which you landed in our family, became our third son. And we raised you from 14 months on. And lucky us and lucky you. I mean, we were all
very lucky me, for sure.
but
You
very
had to put
lucky
you had to
me.
put up with about 10 years of torture before you could start to feel
Well,
lucky. But
I don't know about that, but what I wanted to ask you is if you could tell me the story of your birth, going back before 14 months. What is the story of your birth and how you got your name Chesa?
of course, I know the story. I've told it. I'll tell it to you. But with all things that go back to our first couple of years, and probably even more than that, more recently than that, our memories are memories of memories. And here, what I'm recounting is the story as it's been told to me.
Of course.
And that's become my own memory in many ways. And memory is funny that way. Um, the story goes that and as I understand what happened, I was a breech birth, and that meant I didn't come out head first. I actually came out feet first. And my mother, Kathy, was determined to have a natural birth. She had wanted to do it at home, but because I was breech and refused to turn around, natural birth was out of the question.
So you were very stubborn right then.
I mean, home birth. Yeah, I was very stubborn. Yes, a home birth was out of the question. I refused to cooperate. They tried everything. I'm sure they tried all kinds of hippie remedies and incense and acupressure and massage and who knows what else. And I would not turn around. So they had to do the birth in the hospital, but my mother still managed to do natural birth. I came out feet first. My father, David, was watching the birth and said it looked as though I came dancing into the world. They didn't have a name picked for me, but they wanted something that channeled the energy and the magical moment of my natural foot first birth, of me coming dancing into the world. And they had a very dear friend from their prenatal class who was Kenyan and who happens to be the father of my lifelong best friend.
Mm-hmm.
And because he was Kenyan, he spoke Swahili, and they were thinking about the Swahili language, and they were inspired to choose my name, Chesa, which, as they named me, means dancing feet. It comes from the Swahili verb kucheza, which means to play or sometimes to dance.
Keep dancing, brother. It's great to talk to you, and thank you so much for spending the time.
Thank you. All love all the time. Thank you.
All love. Bye-bye.